Good evening. I'm here to talk about criticism. Juan Pablo Corvalan was so nice to invite me for this presentation, and Archipri, or I think as you pronounce it, Archiprix, was so kind to sponsor my trip to Chile. So thank you both for this opportunity. I want to tell something about criticism because I'm editor-in-chief of Volume magazine. My name is Arjen Oosterman, and criticism is of course part and parcel of what we are doing. Yet criticism is not a given. There is maybe something to say about criticism in general and about the state of criticism at present. To do so, I will present in two parts. First, I'll have a few lines on criticism as such, and next I'll present a project that we call Architecture of Peace as a demonstration of what we, with Volume, consider a meaningful kind of criticism. To tell you that story, I want to read a few sentences, not to miss my own point, so to say. And before I start this short explanation, I have two disclaimers to share. The first disclaimer is, I'm not from your region. I come from the western part of Europe, and that culture may have some important differences with the culture that is dominant here. The other one is that today we visited some projects that the students of Juan Pablo are working on, and it really made me humble on the kind of discussion that we should have or are having in our schools at present, and the kind of realities that you are confronting in your schools. So these two elements we have to maybe discuss later in the exchange, but I want to mention them beforehand. Okay, let's be critical. To be critical is important. To be critical is good. Let's be critical. Notions like critical, critique, criticism, and even criticality refer to an intellectual attitude that we in the West think is essential for a healthy society. There seems to be an intimate relation between the modern project and critique, as there is an intimate relation between modernity and progress. But since modernism and progress have become suspect, what about criticism? To have the freedom of criticism is no small thing. People have given their lives claiming their right to be critical. And although it's such an important notion, I think we've seen a serious inflation of the term, or should we call it erosion. I see two developments undermining the role of criticism as we knew it. One is changes in publishing. Even more than in the 90s, the image is key. A post doesn't exist without a catchy image. And the accompanying text reads more like a caption, an explanation to help interpreting the image, than a reflection as such. There's way more to say about this, but just as an indication. The other one is the peculiar divide that occurred somewhere in the 80s, that criticism and theory became a specialization of its own, since specialists, let's call them critics, take care of criticism and practicing architects produce designs. All of a sudden there was a tribe of critics, and I may be one of them, that make sense of what's being produced, select what seems of importance, and value it on various grounds. It wasn't always like that. If one looks at the history of the architectural magazine, the review, one sees architects discussing among them what values matter most, what solutions perform best, and what ideas are worth exploring. Together, they define the criteria for good architecture in an ever-evolving process of definition and redefinition. When I came to the magazine I still work for, Argis at the time, currently Volume, there were architects in the editorial board that considered it normal. No, they considered it of importance to write as part of their practice. Their definition of a complete architect was one that would read and write next to designing and executing projects, that would publicly value the work of their colleagues. So today we have a situation of one-liners and visual bravura, the issue of populism I haven't touched upon yet, and an internal development in the heart of architecture, a loss of interaction between hand and head. I haven't discussed all because, yes, we do have long reads, and yes, we do see some architects pick up writing and even publishing books again, but I want to suggest a third road, a route to reconnect attitude and production, a form of criticism that doesn't take the object as starting point, that doesn't focus on what's been done, but an explorative and maybe even interventionist way of working. To make my point, or to make my point clear, I would like to introduce one project we're working on with Volume, and it's called Architecture of Peace. To do so, I have to explain yet another thing, and that is why the slide is called From RSVP to AOP. AOP stands for Architecture of Peace, and RSVP stands for RSVP, the acronym that we all know to make a reservation for a ballet or a gathering, a festivity, that kind of invitation, the kind of invitation that you have to wear a smart suit for. The RSVP events, and we have organized 17 so far. I'll skip this one for now. 17, these RSVP events are based on a criticism of how people meet and how people exchange. The criticism is that the formats we know produce kinds of exchanges that we know beforehand. We go to the conference, and before we even have seen what's being presented, we already know what the conclusions of that conference will be. We know who will be there, and maybe the best part of the conference is to actually shake hands with these people in the corridor, not so much the conference itself. The same applies to a lot of other formats that we are familiar with. And to introduce the option that you could meet people that you do not know yet, to exchange on subjects with other disciplines, with people with other backgrounds and interests, we introduced the RSVP events. The more banal description is a hit-and-run affair. There is a date, there is a place in the sense of a city, and there is a subject, a theme. These three are advertised, and people show an interest in joining that particular event, not knowing what the event will be. Depending on the number of subscriptions or applicants, the event is defined in exchange with the people that will attend that event. And that event can be a 3-day travel from one country to another. It can be a flash mob. It can be a hidden conference. It can be many things. And with all these formats, we played around. The interesting element, there's two interesting elements about this. One is the exchanges that are chance exchanges between the participants. The next one, maybe the more important one for us at least, is there's a form of discovery of the local situation that would not have happened without this format, because there is a mix of locals and non-locals that have their own experience with the situation, and this combination produces ideas and questions and insights that were not asked, were not addressed before the event itself. Now this long list, these 17 RSVP events happen to be around the globe, not completely, but in many countries, many places. And several of these were what you could call conflict zones. And one of the chance discoveries that we did was that conflict zones have very specific conditions, and although they are each one of them are unique, nevertheless there are communal components in how conflict zones, post-conflict areas perform and what kind of issues you have to address and reckon with in these situations. Therefore, this is an illustration of the way we advertised RCP events, in this case an ad in one of the books of Rem Koolhaas, the content catalog. And this is an illustration of one of these RCP events, New York, Shrink. The themes are relating to the actual cities that we visited. This one is on Beirut. And these experiences also led to publications, in this case, volume 11 on cities unbuilt, but also a guide, an alternative guide to Beirut was one of the results. And one of our colleagues, Kai Vöckler, did an extensive study in Kosovo on Pristina, on the rebuilding after the war ended, and specifically on informal realities in that city that were pretty grave and are still pretty grave. And he wrote a book, an analysis on that very situation. These kinds of experiences made us understand that there is something to be called architecture or no, post-conflict reconstruction, and that this post-conflict reconstruction requires a specific attitude and a specific knowledge for those that participate in these situations. One of the other findings of this was that architects, designers are hardly involved in these situations, in these post-conflict reconstruction realities. And if I say post-conflict, this is an illustration of the situation you found in Pristina at the time, extensions of housing, in this case vertically, without any building permit or any regulatory control, leading to quite risky situations, both in terms of construction and fire hazards. That kind of realities are things that you have to confront probably in these situations. But there were far more that are interesting and not more than interesting, important to understand. So doing these RCP events, we discovered by chance that there is a theme that you could describe as architecture of peace in these post-conflict situations. And that made us want to invest that very notion and first of all see if architecture can materialize peace, as the question was asked at the time, or formulated at the time. We investigated that topic in 2 issues. We created 2 volume issues, and we invested or tried to understand that topic in a conference and later on in an exhibition that traveled the world. The situation that we were confronted with was one that you could say attracted lots of attention in terms of NGOs, in terms of money, in terms of UN intervention, UN Habitat, peacekeeping forces, you name it, countries and organizations, all paying attention, all stepping to the fore, all bringing funds, and all disrupting the realities in that very situation. And that was maybe one of the first things that surprised, in the sense that although there's a lot of knowledge around, in every situation, again, we saw the same mistakes. And therefore, the outcomes of all this intervention, all this money, all this attention and intelligence was not necessarily positive, was not necessarily great. There were a couple of reasons why this mistake or mismatch happened time and again. One of the aspects is one that we also confronted this afternoon in one of the barrios here around Santiago, and that is complexity. The complexity of the situation is to such a degree that it's not simple to define what the right intervention in that situation is. An intervention that will not just solve, but will indeed help the local situation and not disturb the situation more than the current situation or the current problem actually is. To illustrate that fact, you see a diagram created by the military intelligence of the US, the situation in Afghanistan at that time. That's maybe some 15 years ago now. And I'm not sure that you can read it all, but what it does suggest is that there is an incredible complexity in cultural and power relations in that area that you first have to understand before you even can think of how to address that situation. And coming to grips with what the counterinsurgency strategy was asked a lot of knowledge and a lot of energy before the actual intervention, the actual peacekeeping mission, the actual reconstruction operation can happen. We called the exhibition that we dedicated to this project The Good Cause, Architecture of Peace. I hope that the irony doesn't escape you. I'm sure it doesn't. And it investigated, first of all, the conditions that we are confronted with, the condition of war. There is at every moment in time, there is war ongoing on this planet, and that is a reality that won't stop next year, for sure. From a European point of view, World War II was the mother of all wars, the war that ended war. That was, for a long time, the perception that we had on the situation or the condition of war. But the reality is different, unfortunately. We have seen at least 70 or more wars since, at least if you count the number of peacekeeping missions. And then I don't even count the number of conflicts that didn't lead to a UN intervention. Fortunately, and that is the good news, the international community doesn't sit on its hands, it doesn't stay aside, it tries to indeed address these situations to help internationally, and the peacekeeping missions are a demonstration of that. So there are global maps that'll show you what the situation with war and peace is and was, and there are examples of what we call good cases that illustrate that maybe it is possible to make a difference with design, with architectural intelligence and competence. And we could even list a number of issues or points of attention, maybe, that you would have to take into account if you're going to find yourself in these situations of post-conflict reconstruction. And maybe these points are not only interesting and important for post-conflict reconstruction, maybe they're also important in practice in general, in a, let's say, more normal situation of client and assignment. That research materialized, as said, in issues, books, in an exhibition that was staged in Munich and Montreal, in Copenhagen, The Hague and Istanbul, and in Kigali, I say by heart, an exhibition that showed this story that I just told you, showed these examples I just introduced to you, and tried to persuade an audience that this is a subject that should be dealt with or addressed more extensively and more seriously, but also that design should be on board in these situations, and that is where the faculty, of course, is directly addressed. Fortunately, this faculty, and I really applaud that, does step out into reality, doesn't stay on the theoretical side, but does try to make a difference in the day-to-day reality of poorer neighborhoods, let's call them, and the more difficult situations that most people would rather avoid. And I think that in these situations, but not only in those, the lessons to be learned from this post-conflict investigation can be helpful. The project didn't end with what I just showed. It is ongoing, and the next step is what we call bring it home. Bring it to situations that are at present not all that conflictuous, but that you can expect have certain social tensions that could benefit from the knowledge gained from these post-conflict realities. And that is materializing in 2 studios that we're running in Brussels and in Amsterdam at present, with students investigating this very question: what is an architecture of peace in, for instance, Brussels, or for instance, Amsterdam? And while we're speaking, there is, it ended, I think it just ended, there's a 3rd program ongoing, and that is the Architecture of Peace dialogues that we're currently doing. And in these dialogues, we try to define the agenda for the next phase of research, and not just research, but actual projects to be taken on in this Architecture of Peace process. I show you or I present this Architecture of Peace project as an example of what I would call architecture criticism. That is what you could probably define as a proactive way of working in based on a critical notion and a critical observation of the world that we are surrounded by. I hope it is an inspiring idea to work that way. I'm sure it's not on deaf ears that I present this idea. So thank you for your attention.